opponent in
Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka. How are you?
Hello, Paul.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And you seem to be again donning one of those most exquisite, if I might use a little bit of the English language. You seem to be donning one of the most beautiful works of art reflected in your shirt.
Well, Shaka, they say apples don't fall very far from the tree, so the fact that I hang out with you most of the time, I'm taking it the cue from you.
Really?
Absolutely.
You know, I decided, for example, to put on this blue turtleneck. In a sense, it's a bit nostalgic because guess what? It reminds me of the sweater. We used to call it Georgie at Senior, the only senior secondary school in Africa south of the Sahara, north of Limpopo, Kigezi College, Butoveri.
Okay, we'll get that in a minute. A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Express Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. We talk about politics and whatever questions you have. Today, Shaka will be taking your questions in a moment, but let's start in Sudan. There's still a stalemate, the political crisis there. We have no end in sight. The military ruling council, in a way, is still negotiating its way, trying to figure out how to accommodate pressure from the civilian group that has been advocating for change there. And people are saying, you know what, we are tired, we want these military guys out, but it seems they're coming closer to maybe a solution. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that from what I have seen, it looks like they are actually inching towards a solution. And I think it would be very good for the people of the Sudan, really. I think that it is only realistic that civil society works together with some military authorities to somehow figure out how, for example, to run or conduct a political transition lasting, the last time I saw, the military wanted 2 years, but there should be conditions that these people who are very prominent, for example, in running the transitional government, whether they are military or whether they are civilians, they should be barred from participating or partaking in the upcoming elections, or at least they should be barred from taking actually part in elections, at least for the next 2 terms, for 2 years, so that they do not develop an appetite for being tempted to engage in the business of creative accounting when it comes to elections.
One of, I guess, one of the most renowned public speakers in Africa by the names of P.L. Lumumba likes to talk about how, for example, people who have ideas don't have the power, and those who have ideas have the power. Rather, those who are in charge, really, in charge of our politics, in charge of our governments, don't have ideas. In the context of Sudan or the politics in the region or on the continent, how would you place his words?
I have, first of all, great respect for the intellect, the knowledge, the experience of P.L. Lumumba. I think he has proven, at least in terms of rhetoric, he has proven, for example, that he is remarkably articulate. He does his homework. He has proven himself, frankly, as one of those leading Pan-Africanist intellectuals. No question about it. My only problem is that there seems to be a little bit of generalization, really, generalizing. I think that I agree with him broadly, but I would like him to be a little bit more specific. Come to the point. When he talks about ideas, what does he actually mean? What are ideas, and where do those ideas come from? Where does one, in fact, get those ideas from? For example, are they kept in a bank? Are they kept in a think tank? Are they kept in a university institution? Are they kept in a military institution? Or are they kept in a combination of a military institution, universities and think tanks and all that kind of stuff? And how do you measure ideas? Are those ideas a reflection, for example, of what a lot of people know, that if you are going to talk about intelligence, it is measured through IQ, intelligence quotient, meaning you get it perhaps through reading books, and whether or not, in fact, you can remember and regurgitate some of the things that you have read through books. Is IQ by itself sufficient to give you ideas, for example, to run a neighborhood, to run society, to run a country? Or do you need some other types of measurements? Science has shown very ably that besides the IQ, there are other intelligence types of quotients. There is environmental quotient, for example, which is reflected in social skills and how an individual develops the ability to interact with people. And by interacting with people, you end up sharing some ideas and what have you. And some of those ideas can actually or could be proven, in fact, to work miracles. There is also what is called passion quotient.
Right.
When you have passion quotient, it means that you actually do whatever you do because you have that passion. You actually do not look at it as a job. You enjoy what you are doing. It is like a hobby. But you actually can produce a lot of results. There is another type of intelligence which is called
environmental.
Environmental, I have already said it. There is what is called, I said, passion quotient. There is another one is called curiosity. Quotient. Curiosity. The ability to think, to be visionary, to see very far, to experiment things that have not yet actually been dealt with, that kind of stuff. And so we could go, for example, to the Republic of South Sudan. You have, for example, President, Salva Kiir, Mayardit. He spent his time really fighting for liberating the people of Southern Sudan from one time the largest country on the African continent, the Republic of Sudan. He probably finished high school or dropped out of high school. And his number two man, the man that used to be his number two, Dr. Riek Machar. Dr. Riek Machar has a doctorate of philosophy degree. He has other degrees in engineering and all that kind of stuff. And so when you look at those two individuals, you could actually, on the basis of degrees, certificates, and what have you, you could actually say, you know what? It should actually be the other way around.
Correct.
You should have a Dr. Riek Machar as president of South Sudan, and probably, General Salva Kiir Mayardit as his second in command. But at the end of the day, you probably actually need both.
But how about people who say, for example, there is a school of thought out there that say that sometimes those people with those degrees really are not great at leadership, but they don't exhibit great leadership skills. Yes, they have read all sorts of books, they have PhDs, but when they can't translate that into leadership, managing people, how do you respond to that kind of stuff?
I think you have a point. You have a point in the sense that it is true. We know that, for example, there are some specific individuals. In fact, there are some specific individuals who come to mind as you just talked. For example, when you look at the Republic of Zimbabwe, Until recently, it was a man by the name President Robert Gabriel Mugabe. To be honest with you, I have had the opportunity to interview him once. I am not in a position, obviously, to measure his intelligence and a lot of others. I've never been a professor, nor have I ever been in the business of making judgments about people's intelligences and what have you. But he is, I would say, arguably one of the most highly educated statesmen. If you measured that type of intelligence as reflected in university degrees, he actually has earned 7 university degrees.
Correct.
In different fields. And he is a remarkably articulate individual. No question about it. He has a great presence. He led a liberation, struggle group to the point where he was able to turn what was at one time Rhodesia, a country, by the way, named after some British imperialist by the name Sir John Cecil Rhodes. That is how it became Rhodesia. He was able to essentially liberate Rhodesia into Zimbabwe. But when you look at where Zimbabwe is as we talk, you and I were there in August. We interacted with the people. We saw a lot of different things. You begin to wonder what happened. This is one of the most educated individuals in the world, one of the most remarkably articulate individuals. He had the opportunity to be at the political helm of his country for more than 30 years, if I remember correctly. But where is Zimbabwe? So we have to be very careful when we talk about people who have ideas, have no power, and those who have no ideas have power. Maybe, in fact, what we need to create conditions that allow those two different types of people to figure out how to interact, how to compare notes, and at the end of the day, probably the common denominator will emerge. And out of that, we'll probably get a great leadership. Because, mind you, you do not need an individual, frankly, as a great leader, unless if that great leader had the ability of consulting his people. So that when he is talking about, for example, ideas and what have you, he's not simply talking about himself. You have heard about, for example, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni.
Before you go to that, let's start maybe with comments about, since you want to talk about Uganda, let's talk about what's happening in Uganda. There is a lot of comments coming in. Let's start with Dorothy. Let free Bobby Wine, let Museveni torture. Hold on. Free Bobby Wine. Museveni's torture is leaving Ugandans widowers and orphans and homeless as young people. Your reactions?
I think that President Yoweri Museveni is wasting his time, really, for making it difficult for Ugandans to exercise their constitutional rights. Because otherwise, why do you, in fact, have to have a constitution in the first place? Because if you're a president, the last time I checked, is that you are sworn into office on the basis of the constitution that you have. And your responsibility is to protect it, to defend it, to preserve it. And therefore, people like Bobby Wine actually have rights according to those constitutions. Because let's face it, the last time I checked, Uganda is neither a republic nor a kingdom. I mean, it's neither a monarchy nor a kingdom. It is a republic. And therefore, people like Bobby Wine and his colleagues and what have you actually do have constitutional rights. It's not that the person who is in the State House in Entebbe is really doing them a favor. Because it is not a kingdom. They are not subjects. They are actually citizens. You know, You had Jim Crow in this country. You had people who look like you and me facing a lot of problems to the extent that they never even actually had access to a vote.
Are you equating what's happening in Uganda to the Jim Crow here?
You know, first of all, it is an issue of oppression. It is an issue of rights or the absence of rights. A great man by the name the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, among other things, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When you talk about freedom, Paul, freedom is not limited to Kabale. It is not limited to Nyakajeme. It is not limited to Washington, D.C. It is a universal value. It is a God-given right. It is part of your birthright, you know, the kind of rights that you have really when you come from the womb of your mother and you come down. It is the Magna Carta of being a human being. According to a French great philosopher by the name of Descartes, he came up with this idea that I think, therefore I am. And that was, in fact, an idea that was very, very taken advantage of by a lot of intellectuals and statesmen to actually end, it contributed to end of slavery. You know, those kinds of things. There was another French philosopher, Victor Hugo, who said, you cannot stop an idea whose time has come. There was a slain American civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, who said, you can kill me, you can assassinate everybody and what have you, but at the end of the day, you cannot succeed at assassinating or killing ideas. If the idea, for example, in Uganda is change, it is a matter of time.
How about people who, for example, critics who said that the likes of Bobby Wine, the likes of Kizza Besigye, these are all opposition guys in Uganda, that they are getting external funding. That's what's fueling all these protests that you see taking place. So the government, in a way, has to figure out a way to contain those protests because of what has been going on. You look at the protests in Sudan, they managed to stage a protest that eventually got rid of an ailing dictator, Omar al-Bashir. So could something like this, the funding that is coming from outside, help these guys maybe usher in something like that too?
You know, at the end of the day, it is whether or not there is a reason for engaging in protests. And as I said a little bit earlier, you have a republic here, which is essentially based on a constitution, which is the social contract, really, between the people of Uganda and the government, as it were. Just like it was in Sudan, you have a constitution between the people of Sudan and the government. And these people have rights. And these people have a right to exercise them, unless, of course, if you think you have transformed or translated the Constitution into what some would call a personal manifesto. If it is a personal manifesto, then unfortunately what will probably have to happen is people will also figure out a way of mobilizing themselves, organizing themselves along the lines that the Constitution had allowed them to do. And I think you should give credit to the people and authorities in Sudan for allowing those peaceful type of protests. Eventually, you see what is happening. Because let's face it, you have had so many different types of that kind of situation in Africa. It's not the first time we are seeing it. How did Museveni, for example, come to power? He actually took up arms, AK-47, and went to the Ruwero epicenter. And you know what? He read the situation politically correct. If, in fact, the people were not ready for change, if the people did not support Yoweri Museveni's struggle, the national resistance movement, it would not have worked. But the fact that it worked does not necessarily mean this is the last time that the people of Uganda, for example, will support a group, so long as that kind of concern, the kinds of concerns that people are raising, are legitimate. I have heard, for example, some dictators in Africa, or some dictators in countries which are democratically challenged, ask people whether in fact they can eat this thing called democracy.
Yeah,
no, really.
Interesting.
They say that in fact what you need is service delivery. You need good health care. You need food to eat. You need water to drink. But at the end of the day, the question is service delivery and freedoms, are they in fact mutually exclusive? The answer is no. They are in fact mutually reinforcing.
Let's go to some of your fans in Lusaka, Zambia. They want you to wish the ailing former founding president Kenneth Kaunda a happy birthday. He's turning 95. You've had an opportunity to interact with him. He hosted us at his place, that beautiful place where he's seated right now. They want you to wish him a happy birthday.
It would certainly be a great honor for me to take advantage of these circumstances and wish him the 95th birthday, if I remember correctly. You know, he's a great man, and I remember when we were there last year, I told him that one of the reasons I really came to admire him and some of his colleagues, Tanzanian founding president Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, and the man from Nkrofuru, the kid from Nkrofuru, the Osajefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, people like Seko Ture, people like Kano Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, people like Sasere Sekama of Botswana. You know, those types of people, one thing I liked about them was because they had neither boundaries nor borders in their minds. For them, there was only one thing. It was Africa. It was Africa.
Speaking of...
Kaunda is a great man.
Speaking of Africa, let's go to another question here. Interesting question from John Mwanje. Mr. Shaka, is there any rebel group or military ever fulfilled their claim of democratic governance of a country?
It's very interesting. I can remember an example in Europe. We're talking about a country called Portugal. In 1974, there was this Carnation Revolution. This revolution where the soldiers decided to turn the guns against the dictatorship of Portugal because they were tired of fighting the African freedom fighters who were fighting for their freedom in Angola, fighting for their freedom in Mozambique, in Cape Verde, in places like, you know, these Portuguese-controlled territories, Principe and Sao Tome and all that kind of stuff. And you know what? These guys, they essentially took over in Lisbon without firing a bullet. And the beautiful women of Portugal came with flowers and congratulated them on their efforts. And since that time, by the way, there has been democracy in Portugal.
Let's go to another intriguing comment here from Jen Blaze. When will you bring Hutus to your show to talk about the genocide? It looks like the genocide we talk about is just about the Tutsis, not the Hutus. When are you going to do a show about, for example, give an opportunity to the Hutus to share their stories?
I think that I do not frankly look at people's ethnic groups, at people's religious affiliations. I do not look at people's gender. I do not look at whether people are tall or people are short in order for them to qualify to be panelists on some editions of Straight Talk Africa. But I think that I will in the future be a little bit probably more sensitive to some of those issues that he raises. I don't know whether it's about talking about genocide, but I do know, for example, that we have had some discussions on Rwanda, and I know that there was a time when I did have someone that you would characterize as a Hutu, someone that reflects, you know, that kind of concern. I am talking about the celebrated female freedom fighter of Rwanda, Victoire Ingabire. I have had Victoire Ingabire. Previously, I have also had so many other people. I remember during the Civil War, for example, I used to talk with people like James Gasana. I used to talk with people like Justin Mujenzi. I used to talk with people like Foster Twagiramungu. Paul Rusesabagina. I have talked with a lot of those types of people that he is describing. But again, I must frankly again emphasize that I do not look at people through that sort of lens of experience in order for them to qualify to be panelists on Straight Talk Africa.
Speaking of Straight Talk Africa, what are you talking about tomorrow?
Tomorrow it is going to be very interesting because you know that as we talk, we are talking simply because we happen to be lucky in the sense that we live in a country that allows what is called freedom of speech, freedom of expression. This is a month of celebrating those critical but compelling and important values that any people will need. We're talking about freedom of the press, freedom of the media. Without freedom of the press, freedom of media, to be honest with you, it is very, very difficult for a society to attain democracy.
Very briefly, talk about Alfred Taban, a South Sudanese journalist who passed on. He was one of those freedom fighters that you're referring to in as far as the media landscape in Sudan is concerned.
He was a great journalist. There's no question about it. Very, very courageous. He was that type of person that sometimes I would take a cue from him when he was a BBC correspondent from Khartoum. I would actually, you would find me, you know, glued on my transistor radio, listening to the beautiful voice of Alfred Taban from Khartoum, covering the civil war in the Sudan. And let's face it, he gave the voice to the voiceless. May his soul rest in eternal peace.
On that note, Shaka, thank you so much for being another great guest. Today's segment was remarkable in the sense that you covered a lot. Until then, I'll see you next week on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. So long from Washington.
Thank you. Thank you very much.